I need to talk to everyone about something important, my father said, his face filling the center square of my laptop screen, and I sat up a little straighter in my desk chair in my Portland apartment, thinking maybe this was finally it. Maybe Grandma was getting the surprise party she deserved for her 90th birthday. Maybe I'd actually be included in the planning this time. It was Sunday, March 14th, 2023, exactly 2 p.m. EST, and I'd joined the Zoom call right on time like I always did. The good daughter, the reliable one, even if no one ever seemed to notice. 47 people filled the grid on my screen, little rectangles of cousins and aunts and uncles and second cousins I only saw at weddings and funerals. All of us waiting while Dad cleared his throat in that particular way he had when he was about to make a pronouncement. As you all know, Patricia and I have been working with our estate attorney, he continued, and my mother sat beside him in the frame, her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully neutral in that way she'd perfected over 40 years of marriage. My stomach started to tighten, though I couldn't have said why. Some animal instinct that sensed danger before my conscious mind caught up. We've made some decisions about our will, and I believe in transparency, so I wanted to share this with the family, Dad said. And I watched Derek's face in another square, my older brother at 38 looking so much like Dad, it was almost eerie. That same jaw, that same way of holding himself like he owned whatever room he was in. And beside him, his wife Jennifer smiled encouragingly at the screen. Vanessa was there too, my baby sister at 29, her highlights fresh, and her makeup perfect even for a Sunday Zoom call. And next to her was Brad in his expensive polo shirt, the cardiac surgeon she'd married 3 years ago in a wedding that cost $45,000. We're dividing our estate between our children who've built successful lives and families, Dad said. And the words were so casual, so matter-of-fact, that I almost didn't process them at first. Derek and Vanessa will split everything equally. We've decided to remove Maya from the inheritance entirely. The words hung in the digital air, transmitted through fiber optic cables and satellites to 47 different screens in 47 different locations, and I felt my face get hot, felt my hands go numb, felt something inside my chest crack open like ice on a winter pond. This was real. This was happening. My father had just announced to our entire extended family that I was worth nothing, that I'd failed so completely at life that I didn't deserve even a token acknowledgement in his will, and he'd done it publicly, deliberately, in front of everyone we knew. I was the middle child, the quiet one, the one who'd always faded into the background while Derek got the accolades and Vanessa got the attention. But this was different. This was a formal declaration of my worthlessness, and Dad was still talking, explaining his reasoning like he was presenting a business proposal, and I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only stare at his face on my screen while 46 other faces watched my humiliation unfold in real time. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. Let me be clear about the situation, Dad continued, and I realized with a sick feeling that he wasn't done, that the announcement itself had just been the opening, and now came the explanation, the justification for why his middle child deserved public humiliation. Maya is 34 years old and still renting an apartment. She's never bought property, never invested in her future in any meaningful way. She works some computer job that she can barely explain to people, nothing concrete, nothing you can point to and say, "My daughter built that." His voice carried that particular tone of disappointment I'd heard my entire life. And I watched my mother's face on the screen, waiting for her to say something, anything, to interrupt this recitation of my failures. But Patricia Patel sat silent beside her husband, her hands still folded, her expression still carefully neutral. Derek, on the other hand, and I watched my brother's face shift slightly, settling into satisfaction. Derek has built a thriving orthodontics practice with 3 locations now. He and Jennifer have given us 3 beautiful grandchildren. He owns a home worth $750,000. He's established himself as a pillar of his community. Derek nodded slightly, accepting this praise as his due, and I thought about how his practice was actually struggling, how he'd complained to me 2 Christmases ago about patient retention problems. But of course, Dad didn't know that, because Derek only showed him the success. And Vanessa, Dad continued, his face softening the way it always did when he talked about my baby sister. Vanessa married Bradford, a cardiac surgeon, and they're building a beautiful life together. They're looking at properties in Connecticut now, talking about starting a family. She's made excellent choices. I watched Vanessa try to look modest, but there was something else in her expression too. Something that might have been discomfort, though it was hard to tell on the small screen. My estate is worth approximately $1.2 million, Dad said. And I heard someone gasp, probably one of the younger cousins who didn't realize our parents had that kind of money. And Patricia and I have decided to split it equally between Derek and Vanessa. They have families, expenses, futures to plan for. They've proven themselves responsible. The grid of faces on my screen showed different reactions now that the full explanation was laid out. Uncle Tom was nodding, his expression suggesting he thought this was reasonable financial planning. Aunt Linda looked uncomfortable but not quite upset enough to say anything. Cousin Sarah's mouth was slightly open, shocked. Cousin Mark had his camera off, but I could see his name highlighted like he was talking, probably muted, probably saying something to whoever was in the room with him. My mother's sister, Aunt Grace, looked horrified, her hand over her mouth. But others, maybe a third of the faces on that grid, looked like they agreed, like Dad was making a practical decision based on obvious facts, like the daughter who'd never married, never had children, never bought a house, never achieved anything they could understand. That daughter naturally deserved nothing. I believe in being honest with family, Dad concluded. And the irony of that statement, the sheer audacity of calling this honesty rather than cruelty, made something twist in my chest. Maya is welcome at family gatherings, of course, but the will is final. We've already signed the documents with our attorney. And just like that, it was done. My worth calculated and found wanting. My life's value announced to be exactly $0, broadcast to 47 people on a Sunday afternoon in March while I sat alone in my rented apartment 3,000 miles away. The call ended and I sat frozen in my desk chair, staring at the screen where Dad's face had been moments before. The Zoom window now showing just the bland "meeting has ended" message against a pale background, and my hands were still on the keyboard, though I couldn't remember what I'd been planning to type, couldn't remember anything except the sound of his voice saying those words. Remove Maya from the inheritance entirely, and the way 47 faces had watched it happen. My phone started buzzing immediately, vibrating against the desk surface with that insistent rattle that meant multiple messages were coming in at once, and I looked down to see the screen lighting up with names: Cousin Jennifer, Cousin Mark, Aunt Grace, people reaching out in the immediate aftermath, though I couldn't bring myself to read what they were saying, couldn't face whether they were offering sympathy or agreement with Dad's assessment of my worthless life. The apartment around me felt suddenly smaller. The afternoon light coming through my window somehow wrong. Too bright for what had just happened. Too ordinary for the moment when my father had publicly calculated my value and announced the sum was $0. I picked up my phone finally because it wouldn't stop buzzing, and I saw the messages forming two distinct categories in real time. Maya: I'm so sorry. That was horrible. Are you okay? From people like Aunt Grace and Cousin Sarah. And then the other kind, the ones that were somehow worse than the announcement itself, messages like, maybe take this as a wake-up call, from Cousin Mike, and your dad made some good points about financial responsibility, from Uncle Tom, as if 34 years of being dismissed and overlooked had been justified, as if the public humiliation had been a necessary intervention rather than cruelty. My phone actually rang then, not just a text, but a full call, and I saw Aunt Linda's name on the screen. And I almost didn't answer because I somehow knew exactly what she was going to say. But some old habit of politeness made me swipe to accept. Maya, honey, she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern mixed with condescension that I'd heard my entire life. I know you're upset, but maybe this will motivate you to get your life together, you know? Your father loves you, he's just worried about your future. I sat there listening to her explain how Dad's public humiliation was actually a gift, an opportunity for growth, how maybe now I'd finally settle down, find a husband, buy a house, do all the things that would make me count as a real person in the family's eyes. And I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water that this was it. This was the culmination of 34 years of being invisible, of being the quiet middle child who faded into the background, while Derek got praised for his dental practice, and Vanessa got celebrated for marrying well, and my father had looked at my entire life and decided it amounted to exactly nothing worth acknowledging. And he'd done it in front of everyone we knew, deliberately, publicly, as if my humiliation itself was a lesson the family needed to witness. I sat there after Aunt Linda finally hung up, staring at my phone and feeling the weight of 34 years pressing down on me. And I realized that what had just happened on that Zoom call wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a pattern that stretched back as far as I could remember, a lifetime of being overlooked and dismissed and told in 1,000 different ways that I didn't matter as much as Derek and Vanessa. I thought about my high school graduation in June 2007, how I'd been valedictorian of my class, the first Patel to achieve that honor, and I'd stood on that stage in my cap and gown scanning the audience for Dad's face, already knowing what I'd find, which was an empty seat because he'd left that morning for Boston to attend Derek's orientation at dental school, an event that wasn't even mandatory. Just a welcome session that Derek could have easily attended alone since he was 22 years old at the time. But Dad had insisted on going because this is the beginning of your brother's real future. Mom had come to my graduation, had taken photos and told me she was proud. But even then, I'd seen the distraction in her eyes, the way she kept checking her phone for updates from Dad about Derek's orientation. And when I gave my valedictorian speech about pursuing dreams in unexpected fields, about how technology was going to change the world, I'd watched my mother's attention drift and understood that even my moment of achievement was secondary to whatever Derek was doing 300 miles away. Then there was MIT, the acceptance letter that arrived in March 2008, the thick envelope that meant I'd gotten into one of the best engineering schools in the world, with a partial scholarship based on merit. And I'd been so excited, had called Dad at work to tell him, and he'd said, "That's nice, Maya, but we need to talk about the cost because computer science isn't a real career for women, not like medicine or dentistry. And I'm not sure it's worth the investment when you'll probably just get married and stop working anyway." He'd refused to come to the accepted students' celebration that MIT hosted in our region, had told me it was a waste of time to celebrate something that wasn't practical. And when I'd cried in my room that night, Mom had come in and said, "Your father just worries about money, honey. He wants you to be secure." As if his dismissal of my achievement was actually concern rather than a fundamental rejection of who I was and what I valued. I'd paid for most of MIT myself through scholarships, work-study programs, and student loans that took me 6 years to pay off, while Derek had gotten his entire dental school tuition covered by our parents, $80,000 in total. And when I'd graduated with my computer science degree in 2012, Dad hadn't even asked about job prospects or what I'd learned, had just said, "Well, now you need to find a husband before you get too focused on work," as if my education had been something to tolerate rather than celebrate. And then at 26, in 2015, when I'd saved $15,000 and had a business plan for a tech consulting startup, had done all the market research and financial projections, had come to Dad with the same request Derek had made 2 years earlier when he'd needed $80,000 for his practice down payment. Dad had looked at my carefully prepared presentation and said, "This is a hobby, Maya, not a real business. I'm not going to waste money on something that'll fail within a year." And he'd given Derek the money without even asking for a business plan. Had just written the check because Derek knows what he's doing. By the time I was 30, in 2019, I'd stopped expecting anything different. But it still hurt when Vanessa got engaged to Bradford and Dad immediately offered to pay for the wedding, ended up spending $45,000 on a ceremony at a country club with 300 guests. And when I'd asked casually what he might contribute if I ever got married, he'd said, maybe 5,000, but honestly, Maya, you'll probably divorce anyway given your career focus, so I don't want to invest too much in something temporary. And I'd realized then that in his mind, I was fundamentally defective, incapable of achieving the markers of success that counted in his worldview, and that nothing I did would ever change his assessment of my worth. The reality of my actual career was something my family had never understood and had stopped trying to understand years ago. And the truth was that I'd been working as a systems architect at CloudSync Solutions, a mid-sized but highly respected tech firm in Portland, for 8 years since 2015, earning a salary of $140,000 annually, which wasn't Silicon Valley money, but was more than respectable for the Pacific Northwest and put me comfortably in the upper middle class by any objective measure. But at every family gathering, every Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas celebration, whenever someone asked what I did for work and I tried to explain systems architecture, tried to describe how I designed and implemented the infrastructure that allowed companies to manage their data across multiple platforms, Dad would wave his hand dismissively and say, Maya does computer stuff, as if my entire profession could be reduced to those 3 words, as if 8 years of specialized work and continuous learning and problem solving were equivalent to someone who fixed printers or reset passwords. I'd watch him spend 30 minutes explaining the details of Derek's orthodontics practice, praising his patient retention rates and his investment in new imaging technology. Never mind that Derek's practice was actually fairly mediocre according to industry standards, that he'd had 3 different office managers quit in 2 years, that his Yelp reviews were mixed at best. But Dad would talk about it like Derek was revolutionizing dentistry, would bring it up with such pride that you'd think his son had discovered a cure for cancer rather than putting braces on teenagers. And Vanessa, who hadn't worked since she married Bradford in 2019, was treated like she'd personally achieved every success her surgeon husband accomplished. And when Bradford got promoted to head of cardiovascular surgery at his hospital in 2021, Dad had called a family meeting to celebrate, had taken them out to dinner at an expensive steakhouse, and toasted Vanessa's excellent judgment in choosing a partner, as if her worth was completely derived from the man she'd married, and no one seemed to see anything wrong with this, with the idea that Vanessa's value came from Bradford's career, while my own career was dismissed as computer stuff not worth discussing. What my family didn't know, what they'd never asked about and therefore never learned, was that I'd been doing independent research and development projects on the side for years, working nights and weekends on problems that interested me, exploring applications and algorithms that went beyond my day job responsibilities. And I'd never mentioned these projects at family gatherings because I'd learned through decades of experience that no one would care, that any attempt to explain what I was working on would be met with glazed eyes and quick subject changes, and Dad's inevitable dismissal of anything technology-related as trivial compared to Derek's dental work or Bradford's surgeries. So I'd stopped trying to share that part of my life with them, had stopped bringing up the conferences I attended, or the professional papers I read, or the innovations I was developing, and I'd let them believe that my life was as small and inconsequential as they decided it was, because it was easier than fighting for recognition I was never going to receive, easier than explaining complex technical concepts to people who'd already determined that my work didn't matter, and that I, by extension, didn't matter either. The patent itself had started 18 months earlier, in September 2021, when I'd been working on a personal project that had nothing to do with my job at CloudSync Solutions, exploring a problem that had fascinated me for years about how data compression algorithms handled redundancy in cloud storage systems. And I'd been tinkering with different approaches in my home office on evenings and weekends, filling notebooks with calculations and running simulations on my personal server. Not because anyone had asked me to, or because I thought it would lead anywhere particularly profitable, but simply because the problem was interesting, and solving interesting problems was what had always brought me joy, even when no one in my family understood or cared about that joy. I'd had a breakthrough one night in late September, around 2 in the morning, when I should have been sleeping, but instead was staring at my monitor watching a simulation run, and I'd seen something in the data patterns that made me sit up straight, made me realize that there was a way to compress certain types of streaming data that was fundamentally different from existing approaches, more efficient by nearly 18% in my initial tests, and I'd spent the next 6 weeks refining the algorithm, testing it against every edge case I could think of, documenting everything meticulously, because I'd learned in my MIT courses that documentation was the difference between a clever idea and something you could actually protect and monetize. By November 2021, I'd filed for the patent with the help of James Chen, a patent attorney I'd found through a professional connection at a tech conference, and James had been enthusiastic about the application in a way that made me think this might actually be significant, might be something that could have real commercial value, though I'd tried not to get my hopes up because I'd learned not to expect too much from life, not to believe that my work would be recognized or valued by anyone beyond myself. The patent application process had taken 14 months, which James said was actually relatively fast given the complexity of the technology and the thoroughness of the USPTO's review, and in January 2023, just 2 months before that terrible Zoom call, I'd received the notification that my patent had been approved, that I was now the official inventor of record for a novel data compression algorithm with applications in cloud storage and streaming technology, and I'd stared at that approval letter feeling a surge of pride that I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever, because this was something I'd created entirely on my own. Something that had nothing to do with my family's expectations or approval. Something that existed independent of their assessment of my worth. But I hadn't told anyone in my family about the patent, hadn't mentioned it at Christmas dinner in 2022, or in any of the phone calls with my mother in the weeks that followed. Because by that point, I'd been in preliminary negotiations with 3 major tech companies about licensing the technology, and I'd hired Rebecca Torres, a licensing consultant who specialized in intellectual property deals, and Rebecca had advised me to keep things quiet until we had a solid offer on the table. But the deeper truth was that I'd kept it quiet because I'd been conditioned by 34 years of dismissal to believe that nothing I did would matter to my family anyway, that even if I told them about the patent, they'd find a way to minimize it or change the subject or compare it unfavorably to Derek's orthodontics practice. And I was so tired of fighting for recognition that I'd decided to just let this achievement exist in the part of my life that my family never saw and never asked about. The timing of Dad's announcement on that Zoom call, the bitter irony of being publicly declared worthless just weeks after receiving patent approval, and while I was in active negotiations that could change my life, wasn't lost on me even in those first horrible hours after he'd humiliated me in front of 47 family members. And I remember thinking that if this were a movie, the timing would seem too perfect, too contrived. But real life didn't care about narrative symmetry or poetic justice. And sometimes the universe just handed you these moments of crystallized irony, where your father declared you a failure at the exact moment you were succeeding beyond anything he'd ever accomplished himself. The week after the Zoom call passed in a strange fog, where I went through the motions of my normal work routine at CloudSync Solutions, but felt like I was moving underwater, disconnected from everything around me. And I knew my coworkers noticed something was wrong because I'd always been reliable and focused, and suddenly I was staring at my monitor without seeing anything, losing track of conversations in meetings, forgetting to respond to emails that normally I'd answer within an hour. I told myself I was fine, that I just needed to process what had happened and move on, that my father's public declaration that I'd amounted to nothing was just his opinion and didn't define my reality. But the truth was that the humiliation had burrowed deep into a place that had been wounded so many times before that I wasn't sure how to begin healing it. And by Thursday afternoon, when I realized I'd been looking at the same line of code for 20 minutes without comprehending a single character, I knew I was falling apart in a way I couldn't hide much longer. Priya Sharma, who'd been my closest friend since she'd joined CloudSync 3 years earlier, and who sat in the cubicle next to mine, finally cornered me in the break room around 3 o'clock when I was standing in front of the coffee maker, having forgotten why I'd walked over there in the first place. And she said, "Okay, that's it. We're going to get dinner tonight, and you're going to tell me what's going on, because you've been a zombie all week and I'm worried about you." And I tried to deflect, tried to say I was just tired, but Priya had a way of seeing through my defenses that made lying to her impossible. So I agreed to meet her at the Thai restaurant near our office at 6:30. Over pad Thai and spring rolls that I barely tasted, I told her everything. The whole terrible story spilling out in a way it hadn't with anyone else. Not just about the Zoom call and Dad's announcement, but about the 34 years of context that made that moment so devastating, about being invisible and dismissed and treated like I didn't matter. And Priya listened with an expression that progressed from shock to outrage to something that looked almost like grief. And when I finally finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Maya, your family has no idea who you actually are." And something about the way she said it, with such certainty and such sadness, made me realize she was right, in a way I'd never fully articulated to myself. I'd spent so long being conditioned to invisibility that I'd stopped trying to be seen, had stopped putting my achievements out into the world because I'd learned that no one in my family cared, and I'd somehow generalized that to mean no one anywhere would care. And Priya pointed out that I didn't even have my MIT diploma on my apartment wall, that the patent approval letter from January was probably buried in a drawer somewhere instead of framed, that I'd learned to make myself small because being small was safer than reaching for recognition and being rejected again. "They don't deserve you," Priya said, her voice fierce in a way I'd never heard before, and I felt something crack open in my chest, some protected place where I'd been storing all the hurt and disappointment of a lifetime. And I started crying right there in the restaurant, not quiet tears, but big gasping sobs that made the couple at the next table look over with concern. And Priya moved around to my side of the booth and put her arm around me and let me cry until I was empty. Rebecca Torres called me on Friday afternoon, March 17th. Exactly 3 days after the Zoom call that had shattered whatever fragile connection I'd still maintained with my family. And when I saw her name on my phone screen, I almost didn't answer, because I was still in that fog of humiliation and grief, still replaying my father's words in an endless loop. But something made me pick up on the third ring, and Rebecca's voice was bright with an excitement that felt like it was coming from another universe, a place where good things still happened, and people could feel joy without it being complicated by decades of family dysfunction. "Maya, I have incredible news," she said, and I could hear her smiling through the phone, could picture her in her downtown Seattle office with the view of Elliott Bay that I'd admired during our first meeting 6 months earlier. "The negotiations with TechCore Industries have concluded, and they're making an offer." I sat down on my couch, the same couch where I'd been sitting when Dad had announced I'd amounted to nothing, and I felt my heart start to race in a way that was both terrifying and thrilling, because I'd been waiting for this call for months, but had started to believe that maybe the patent wasn't as valuable as James Chen had thought. Maybe I'd been foolish to hope for anything significant. Maybe this was just going to be another disappointment in a life that suddenly felt full of them. Rebecca continued, her words coming faster now as she walked me through the details. TechCore wants to license your compression algorithm for use across their entire cloud storage platform and their streaming services division, and they're offering $2.8 million as an upfront licensing fee, plus 4% royalties on all products that incorporate the technology. And their projections estimate those royalties at somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000 annually for at least the next 10 years. Possibly longer, depending on adoption rates and market expansion. I couldn't breathe. I literally couldn't draw air into my lungs for what felt like a full minute, but was probably only seconds. And Rebecca must have sensed something because she said, "Maya, are you there?" And I managed to make a sound that wasn't quite a word, but apparently communicated that I was still conscious. $2.8 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real, didn't connect to anything in my experience or my understanding of what my life was supposed to look like. And Rebecca was still talking about contract terms and signing schedules and asking when I could come to Seattle to meet with TechCore's legal team. And I heard myself saying something about being available whenever they needed me, my voice sounding strange and distant, like it belonged to someone else. "The contracts should be ready for review by early next week," Rebecca said, "and if everything looks good, which I'm confident it will because we've been negotiating the terms for 3 months, we could have you signing by the end of the month, maybe March 28th if we can get everyone coordinated, and the payment typically processes within 3 to 5 business days after signing." March 28th, exactly 2 weeks after the Zoom call. I would sign a contract that would make me a millionaire exactly 14 days after my father had publicly declared me worthless, had announced to 47 family members that I'd never amounted to anything and never would. The cosmic irony of it was so sharp it almost made me laugh, except I couldn't laugh because I was crying again, but these were different tears than the ones I'd cried with Priya at the Thai restaurant. These were tears of something I hadn't felt in so long I almost didn't recognize it. Something that felt like vindication mixed with grief, mixed with a wild disbelief that this was actually happening to me. Maya Patel, the invisible middle child who'd learned to expect nothing and had trained herself not to want recognition because wanting it hurt too much when it never came. I signed the contract on March 28th, 2023, in Rebecca Torres's Seattle office, with the spring rain streaking down the floor-to-ceiling windows and Mount Rainier invisible behind the gray clouds, and my hand shook slightly as I wrote my name on page after page of legal documents that James Chen walked me through with careful precision, explaining clauses about intellectual property rights and licensing terms and royalty structures that I barely absorbed because all I could think about was the number at the top of the payment schedule, $2,800,000. The signing took 90 minutes, with breaks for questions I mostly didn't have because Rebecca and James had spent the previous 2 weeks preparing me for this moment, walking me through every detail until I understood exactly what I was agreeing to. But understanding it intellectually and feeling it emotionally were completely different things. And when I finally signed the last page and James said, "Congratulations, Maya. You're now a licensing partner with one of the largest tech companies in the world," I felt like I was going to either throw up or pass out, or possibly both. Rebecca shook my hand with genuine warmth and said the payment would process within 3 to 5 business days, that I should see the deposit in my account by April 3rd at the latest. And I nodded and thanked her and James and walked out of the office building into the Seattle rain, feeling like I'd left my body somewhere around page 47 of the contract and was now just a consciousness floating through a reality that didn't quite make sense anymore. I drove back to Portland in a daze, the 5-hour drive passing in what felt like both minutes and days, and I kept thinking about my father's voice on that Zoom call 2 weeks earlier, the certainty with which he'd announced that I'd never amounted to anything, the casual cruelty of declaring my worthlessness to 47 family members, and how in exactly the same week that he'd made that pronouncement, I'd been finalizing a deal that would make me wealthier than he'd ever been. The money hit my account on April 1st. 3 days after signing, and I sat on my couch in my rental apartment staring at my phone screen, at the number that had appeared in my checking account balance like it had been conjured by some kind of cosmic joke, $2,800,000. I stared at it for what must have been 20 minutes, refreshing the banking app over and over to make sure it was real, that the numbers weren't going to suddenly rearrange themselves into something more reasonable, more aligned with what my life was supposed to look like. I was wealthier than my father's entire estate, the one he was splitting between Derek and Vanessa, while explicitly excluding me. I had more money in my checking account right now than Derek had made in his entire career as an orthodontist. I was financially independent in a way I'd never imagined possible, and I sat with that information for days, not telling anyone except Priya, not making any moves or decisions, just existing in this strange new reality where the fundamental facts of my life had shifted so dramatically that I didn't know who I was supposed to be anymore. Priya came over on April 3rd with a bottle of champagne and an expression of fierce pride, and she said, "You need to rub this in their faces, all of them, everyone who ever made you feel small." But I realized as she said it that revenge wasn't what I wanted, or at least not revenge in its simplest form. I didn't want to hurt my family the way they'd hurt me. I wanted something harder to articulate, something that felt more like recognition than vindication, more like being seen than being proven right. I wanted my father to know he'd been wrong about me, catastrophically wrong, and I wanted him to have to sit with that knowledge. I wanted them all to see me, really see me, maybe for the first time in my entire life. Easter Sunday arrived on April 9th, 2023. And I woke up in my Portland apartment at 6 in the morning with a decision already made somewhere in my subconscious before my conscious mind had fully engaged. The knowledge that I was going to drive the 5 hours to my parents' house in Greenwich, Connecticut for the family gathering that I hadn't been explicitly uninvited to, but that everyone, including me until that moment, had assumed I wouldn't attend after what had happened on that Zoom call 26 days earlier. I packed a small overnight bag, even though I had no intention of staying overnight, the bag functioning as some kind of psychological safety net, and I got in my car at 7:30 and started the drive east, with my hands tight on the steering wheel and my mind racing through everything I might say or not say, every possible scenario of how this could unfold, every version of the confrontation I'd been playing out in my head since April 1st, when that impossible number had appeared in my bank account. The drive took me through the tail end of the Columbia River Gorge, and then onto highways that blurred together as I thought about what had shifted in me over the past 3.5 weeks, how the money itself wasn't what had changed me, but rather what the money represented. The concrete, undeniable proof that my father had been wrong about me, that his assessment of my worth had been based on nothing but his own limitations and biases, and his inability to see anything that didn't fit his narrow definition of success. I wasn't confrontational by nature, had spent 34 years learning to be quiet and unobtrusive and easy to overlook. But something fundamental had cracked open in me, and I couldn't go back to being invisible now, even if I'd wanted to. Couldn't pretend that the Zoom call hadn't happened, or that the humiliation hadn't cut me in a way that wouldn't heal without acknowledgement. I arrived at my parents' colonial-style house in Greenwich at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The circular driveway already crowded with cars I recognized. Derek's black Audi, Vanessa and Brad's Tesla, Uncle Tom's pickup truck, Aunt Linda's silver sedan. And I sat in my car for a full 3 minutes before I could make myself get out and walk to the front door, my heart pounding in a way that made me feel both terrified and strangely alive. My mother opened the door before I could knock, and her face went through a visible series of emotions: surprise, confusion, something that might have been guilt, before she managed to say, "Maya, I didn't think you'd come." And I heard in those words all the things she wasn't saying, all the assumptions my family had made about how thoroughly they'd broken me, how completely they expected me to accept my exile. The awkwardness hit me like a physical wall as I stepped inside and saw them all in the living room and spilling into the dining room where the table was set with my mother's good china. Derek and his wife Jennifer with their 3 kids running around. Vanessa and Brad standing near the window looking like they'd stepped out of a catalog for wealthy young couples, and my father in his armchair like a king holding court, and scattered throughout were aunts and uncles and cousins, maybe 15 extended family members in total. And when I walked in, the conversations didn't stop exactly, but they faltered, and I saw people notice me and then quickly look away, as if eye contact might somehow obligate them to acknowledge what had happened on that Zoom call. The gathering was excruciating in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. The social dynamics I'd endured for 34 years now laid bare and hypervisible because I was seeing them through different eyes, through the eyes of someone who knew her worth, even if no one in this room did. People avoided mentioning the Zoom call with a studied care that made its absence more obvious than direct discussion would have been. Conversations carefully steering around anything that might touch on estates or wills or family decisions. And I was treated with a mixture of pity and dismissal that felt so familiar it was almost comforting in its predictability. Like slipping into an old coat that had never fit right, but that I'd worn so long I'd stopped noticing the way it constricted my shoulders. My father barely acknowledged my presence beyond a brief nod when I first entered the dining room. His attention focused entirely on Derek and Vanessa and their respective families, asking Derek detailed questions about his practice expansion plans, and nodding with deep satisfaction as Derek explained he was looking at opening a second location in Fairfield County, potentially bringing in 2 associate orthodontists to handle the patient overflow. I sat at the far end of the table during dinner, next to Cousin Beth's teenage daughter, who spent the entire meal on her phone, and I ate my ham and roasted potatoes and green bean casserole while Derek held court at the other end, and I heard him say at one point, his voice carrying clearly down the table, "The thing is, some people understand wealth building and long-term financial planning, and some people just never develop that mindset, you know what I mean?" And he wasn't looking at me when he said it, but the implication was clear enough that Jennifer touched his arm gently as if to quiet him, though the damage was already done. Vanessa and Brad were talking with my parents about the vacation homes they were considering in the Hamptons, showing photos on Vanessa's phone of multi-million-dollar properties with private beach access, and my father beamed with such obvious pride as he looked at those photos, saying, "You two have built such a beautiful life together. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished." And the fact that Brad's surgeon's salary was what had built that life, and not anything Vanessa had done herself, seemed irrelevant to everyone at the table. I ate my food and stayed quiet, watching these dynamics I'd endured my entire life play out exactly as they always had. The golden children praised for achievements both real and borrowed, the overlooked child ignored even when sitting 10 feet away, and I felt the old familiar ache of invisibility combined with something new, something that felt almost like anthropological detachment, as if I were studying a foreign culture rather than participating in my own family. The revelation that had crystallized in me over the past 3.5 weeks, since that morning I'd seen those numbers in my bank account, was simply this: these people don't determine my worth, they never did, and the fact that I'd spent 34 years seeking validation from people who were constitutionally incapable of seeing me was tragic, but it wasn't unfixable because I could see myself now even if they couldn't. After dinner, we moved into the living room, with its familiar landscape of family photos covering the mantel, most of them featuring Derek's 3 children, or Vanessa's wedding, or various family gatherings where I appeared, if at all, as a blurry figure in the background, and people settled into the various sofas and chairs with coffee and my mother's famous apple pie while the kids ran upstairs to the playroom, and I found myself standing near the bookshelf, feeling like a ghost at my own family gathering, until my father cleared his throat in that particular way he had when he wanted everyone's attention, and the room gradually quieted as people turned toward him in his leather armchair that he'd owned for as long as I could remember, the throne from which he'd delivered so many pronouncements about all of our lives over the years. He had his reading glasses on, and he was holding a leather portfolio that I recognized as the one he kept important documents in, and he said, "I want to update everyone on some family business, since we're all here together," and my stomach clenched because I knew instinctively what was coming, could feel it in the air like the pressure before a thunderstorm. "Patricia and I met with our attorney last week," he continued, looking at my mother who sat on the arm of his chair with her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of unity that made me feel like I was watching them from across an enormous distance. "And we've finalized the updates to our estate plan that I mentioned on the family call last month. Everything is officially documented now with the firm." He looked directly at Derek, and then at Vanessa, with an expression of such satisfaction and pride that something in my chest actually physically hurt. "I'm setting up my children for success," he said, and he emphasized the word children in a way that seemed designed to exclude me from that category, as if I existed in some other classification entirely, some lesser designation that didn't merit the same consideration. Making sure that when your mother and I are gone, the people who have built real lives and real families will have the resources to maintain and grow what they've created. Derek nodded solemnly, as if he were receiving some sacred responsibility rather than just money he hadn't earned, and Vanessa reached for Brad's hand with an expression that managed to be both grateful and smug. And I watched this scene unfold with a strange split consciousness. Part of me still the invisible daughter who had learned to absorb these wounds in silence, but another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since April 1st, suddenly reached a breaking point that I hadn't known was coming. "Dad," I heard myself say, and my voice sounded loud in the room even though I hadn't raised it. "We need to talk about what you did on that Zoom call." The room went completely silent. Every conversation stopped. People froze with coffee cups halfway to their mouths. My father turned to look at me with an expression of irritation mixed with surprise, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. "I made a practical decision based on reality, Maya," he said, his tone dismissive in that way I knew so well, that way that had taught me over 34 years, that my thoughts and feelings were inconvenient interruptions to the important business of the family. Your siblings have built something with their lives. They have families and responsibilities and futures that need to be secured. Something had broken open in me, or maybe something had finally sealed shut. The part of me that had spent 34 years absorbing these wounds in silence, suddenly unable to continue in that role. And I felt my voice gaining strength, even as my hands trembled at my sides. "You want to talk about what they've built?" I said, and I could hear the emotion in my voice, but I didn't try to hide it anymore. Didn't try to make myself smaller or quieter or more palatable. "Let's talk about what I've built while you weren't paying attention, while you were so busy praising Derek for his mediocre orthodontics practice and Vanessa for marrying well that you never once asked me what I was working on." Derek stood up from the sofa, his face flushed. "Maya, this isn't the time or place for this conversation," he said in that patronizing tone he'd perfected over the years, the voice of the golden child who'd never had to fight for recognition. "We can discuss this privately if you're upset." But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop now that I'd started. "No, Derek, we're going to discuss it right here, right now, in front of everyone. Because that's exactly what Dad did to me on March 14th when he told 47 family members that I amounted to nothing, when he announced to our entire extended family that I was so worthless I didn't deserve to be included in his will." I turned back to my father, who was gripping the arms of his leather chair with an expression that was equal parts discomfort and defensiveness. "I was the only one of your 3 children who paid my own way through college. Did you know that?" "MIT, Dad. I got into MIT, and you refused to even come to the acceptance celebration because you said computer science wasn't a real career for women, remember? You paid Derek's full tuition to dental school, every penny of it, but I worked 3 jobs to cover my expenses because you said I should focus on finding a husband instead of wasting time on technology." My mother had started crying, quiet tears running down her face, but she didn't interrupt, didn't defend my father the way she'd stayed silent on that Zoom call. "When I was 26 and wanted to start a consulting business, I asked you for a loan of $15,000, and you said no, you called it a hobby, but the same year you gave Derek $80,000 for his practice down payment, you handed him a check without hesitation." Derek opened his mouth to speak, but I kept going, the words pouring out after years of swallowing them. "When Vanessa got married, you paid $45,000 for her wedding. You spared no expense. But you told me if I ever got married, I'd get $5,000 maximum, because I'd probably divorce. Anyway, those were your exact words, and you thought it was funny when you said it. Aunt Linda, sitting on the love seat near the window, looked down at her hands. And I remembered her phone call the day after the Zoom humiliation, her voice saying, "Maybe this will motivate you to get your life together." And I wondered if she was remembering it too. My father shifted in his chair, his defensive expression cracking slightly. "You're being dramatic, Maya," he said, but his voice had less certainty in it now. "I made a financial decision based on practical considerations. Derek and Vanessa have families, they have expenses and responsibilities, they have futures that need to be secured." "And I don't?" I said, and my voice broke slightly on the words. "I don't have a future? I don't have value? You stood in front of our entire family and told them I never amounted to anything. That I was still renting at 34 like that was some kind of moral failure, that I worked some computer job like my career was meaningless, and you did it publicly, deliberately, to humiliate me." "You told 47 people I amounted to nothing," I said, and I could feel my voice gaining a kind of power I'd never accessed before, the power that comes from finally speaking a truth that's been suppressed for so long, it's become toxic. "You humiliated me publicly because you decided my life has no value. You made a spectacle of my worthlessness in front of our entire extended family, people I've known my entire life, and you did it deliberately, consciously. You scheduled a Zoom call and gathered everyone together so you could announce that I wasn't worth including in your legacy." Several of my cousins were looking down at their hands now, and I could see the discomfort on their faces, the recognition perhaps that they'd witnessed something cruel and hadn't spoken up. And Aunt Linda, who had called me the day after to tell me this might motivate me to get my life together, now looked like she wanted to disappear into the upholstery of the love seat. My father's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward in his chair, with that stubborn expression I knew so well, the look that said he'd made up his mind and no amount of emotion or reason would change it. "Maya, you're being unreasonable," he said, his voice taking on that lecturing tone he'd used throughout my childhood, whenever I dared to express hurt or disappointment. "You rent an apartment at 34 years old, you work some computer job that none of us understand, you're not married, you don't have children, you don't have any prospects that I can see, and I'm being realistic about the situation, I'm being practical about where my estate should go to do the most good." The words hit me like physical blows, each one a confirmation of every terrible thing I'd believed about how he saw me. And I felt something crack open in my chest, but instead of pain flooding out, there was a strange clarity, a calm certainty about what I needed to do next. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, and my hands were steadier than I expected them to be as I unlocked it and opened my banking app, and I navigated to my checking account, where I'd kept $500,000 in liquid funds while the rest of the money sat in the investment accounts that Rebecca Torres had helped me set up. "You want to talk about being realistic?" I said, and I turned the phone screen toward my father, holding it steady so he could see the numbers clearly. The balance that read $512,847.63 in my Chase checking account. "This is my checking account, Dad. This is $500,000. The rest is invested." The room went completely still, the kind of silence that feels almost solid, as if the air itself had frozen, and I watched my father's face as he stared at the screen, his eyes moving across the numbers like he was trying to decode them, like they were written in a language he didn't understand. And his mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "This is my checking account, Dad," I said, and my voice was steady now, clear and strong in a way it had never been in this house, in front of these people who had spent 34 years not seeing me. "This is $500,000. The rest is invested." The room went so silent I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, could hear someone's breath catch, could feel the weight of every eye in the room shifting between my face and the phone screen I held out toward my father, and I watched him stare at the numbers like they were written in a foreign language, his mouth opening and closing without sound, his face draining of color. "Where did you—" he started, but the words died in his throat, and I pulled the phone back, holding it in both hands now, like it was evidence in a trial, which in a way I suppose it was. 18 months ago, in September 2021, I developed a new algorithm for data compression, I said, and I spoke clearly, deliberately, wanting every person in this room to hear every word, to understand every detail they'd never bothered to ask about. It has applications in cloud storage and streaming technology, applications that affect millions of devices, and I filed for a patent in November 2021. Worked with a patent attorney named James Chen and a licensing consultant named Rebecca Torres for months while I negotiated with three major tech companies. I could see Derek leaning forward on the sofa, his face flushed red now, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell, and Vanessa had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide, and my mother had stopped crying and was staring at me like I was a stranger, like she was seeing someone she'd never met before standing in her living room. The patent was approved in January 2023, I continued, and I felt a strange sense of power in laying out these facts, these concrete, irrefutable details of a life they'd never known I was living. 2 months before Dad's Zoom call. 2 months before he told 47 people I'd never amounted to anything. And 3 weeks ago, on March 28th, exactly 2 weeks after that humiliation, I signed a licensing agreement with TechCore Industries. I paused, letting that name sink in, watching recognition flicker across a few faces, because TechCore was a Fortune 500 company, the kind of name even people who didn't work in tech would recognize. The deal was for $2.8 million up front, I said, and I heard someone gasp, heard what might have been Aunt Linda making a small sound in her throat, plus 4% royalties on all products using the technology, which is estimated to generate between $300,000 and $500,000 annually for at least the next 10 years. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, charged with a kind of shock that bordered on disbelief, and I watched my father's face as he processed the numbers, as he did the math in his head, and realized what I was telling him. "I'm not just vindicated, Dad," I said quietly. "I'm worth more than your entire estate, the $1.2 million you're splitting between Derek and Vanessa, the estate you removed me from because you decided I had no value, no prospects, no future worth investing in." My father stammered, his face still drained of color, his eyes still trying to make sense of what I'd shown him, and the words came out fragmented and confused. "You never said anything about this, Maya. You never mentioned you were working on anything like this. How were we supposed to know?" And I cut him off, not with anger exactly, but with a clarity that felt like it had been building in me for 34 years, waiting for this exact moment to crystallize into words. "You never asked, Dad," I said, and my voice was quiet now, but it carried through the room with more weight than any shouting could have achieved, and I watched his face as those three words landed, as the simple, devastating truth of them settled over everyone in the room. "In 34 years, you never once asked me what I was working on. You never asked about my research. You never asked about my projects or my goals or what I was building in those hours I spent at my computer that you dismissed as me wasting time on hobbies." I could feel the attention of everyone in the room focused entirely on me now, a kind of attention I'd never experienced from these people in my entire life, and it felt strange and powerful and sad all at once, because it had taken a bank statement to make them finally listen. Every time I tried to talk about my work, you called it computer stuff and changed the subject. You literally turned away from me mid-sentence to ask Derek about his practice or Vanessa about her wedding plans. You decided I was worthless without ever knowing me, without ever asking who I actually was or what I was actually doing with my life. My father opened his mouth, but no. Words came out, and I could see something crumbling in his expression, some defensive structure he'd built to justify his treatment of me beginning to crack, and I pressed forward because I needed him to understand all of it, the full scope of what he'd never seen. "I'm a named inventor on a patent that's going to be in millions of devices, Dad, in phones and computers and streaming services that millions of people use every single day. And I did that with the education from MIT, the school whose acceptance you refused to celebrate because you told me computer science wasn't a real career for women. The degree I paid for entirely myself because you gave Derek $80,000 for his practice, but wouldn't give me $15,000 to start a business. I could see my mother's hand covering her mouth now, could see tears starting again in her eyes, but different tears this time. Not tears of embarrassment, but something that looked like grief or recognition. I've already been contacted by 2 other companies about consulting work, about bringing my expertise to their development teams, and James Chen, my patent attorney, says I'm positioned to file at least 3 more patents in the next 2 years, based on the research I'm currently doing, the research I do in my rental apartment that you're so ashamed of, the apartment I chose because I was investing every spare dollar into my work instead of into impressing you with real estate. Derek had his arms crossed now, his face still red, and I could see his jaw clenching and unclenching, and Vanessa was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between shock and what might have been the first stirrings of respect, and my father just sat there in his armchair looking smaller somehow, diminished, as if the revelation of my success had physically reduced him. The room erupted into chaos, not the loud explosive kind, but the kind where everyone seemed to be moving and talking at once in hushed urgent tones, and I watched it all from the center of the storm I'd created, feeling strangely calm now that the truth was finally out in the open after 34 years of being hidden. Cousin Marcus, who I'd barely spoken to in a decade, suddenly stood up from where he'd been sitting near the window, his phone in his hand and his face transformed with recognition, and he said loudly enough to cut through the murmuring, "Wait, are you the Maya Patel on the compression algorithm patent? The one that's been all over the tech news for the past 2 months?" I turned to look at him, this cousin who worked for some software company in Boston, and I nodded slowly, watching his expression shift from shock to something like awe, and he ran his hand through his hair looking completely stunned. "Oh my God, I had no idea that Patel was you. I never made the connection. We've been talking about your algorithm at work, about how it's going to revolutionize cloud storage efficiency, and you're my cousin and I didn't even know." Other family members were pulling out their phones now. I could see them typing, searching, their faces illuminated by the glow of their screens. And I watched as they found the articles Marcus was talking about. The tech industry coverage I'd seen, but never thought my family would care about or understand. And I could see the exact moment when each person realized this was real. When the skepticism or confusion on their faces shifted into something else. Aunt Linda, who had told me just 4 weeks ago that maybe Dad's public humiliation would motivate me to get my life together, was staring at her phone with her hand over her mouth, her face flushed with what I recognized as mortification. And she wouldn't meet my eyes now, though she'd had no problem lecturing me when she thought I was the family failure. Derek stood up abruptly, his face still red but darker now, and he said with forced casualness that didn't quite mask the edge in his voice, "Well, that's great, Maya, really. That's a fantastic achievement. But money isn't everything, you know. There's more to life than bank accounts and patents." I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. The sound came out sharp and clear in the shocked silence of the room, and I saw him flinch slightly at it because he'd never heard me laugh like that, with something that wasn't quite humor but wasn't quite bitterness either. "You're absolutely right, Derek," I said, and my voice was steady and clear, and I was smiling, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who'd finally understood a joke that had been at her expense for her entire life. Money isn't everything, which is exactly why it hurt so much that Dad used money as the only measure of my worth, used my bank account and my rental apartment and my lack of a husband with a prestigious career as evidence that I'd amounted to nothing. And even with all those supposedly important factors, I still failed in his eyes. I was still so worthless that he removed me from his will and announced it to 47 people on a Zoom call. The room went quiet again, that heavy, charged silence that had been falling over us in waves throughout this entire confrontation. And I looked at my father, who was still sitting in his armchair, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen him look, his face gray and his hands gripping the armrests, like he needed something to hold on to. My father finally spoke, and his voice came out quiet and almost confused, stripped of the defensive certainty he'd had just moments before, and he said, "Why didn't you tell us, Maya? Why didn't you say anything about what you were working on? About the patent? About any of this?" And I looked at him sitting there in his armchair, this man who had spent 34 years making me feel invisible, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger exactly, but a deep, weary sadness for all the years we'd both lost, because he couldn't see me, and I'd stopped trying to be seen. "I didn't tell you because I've been conditioned not to share, Dad," I said, and my voice was quieter now but steady, and I could feel the exhaustion of 3 decades settling into my words. "Every time I tried to tell you about an achievement, you minimized it, or changed the subject, or found a way to make it seem less important than whatever Derek or Vanessa was doing, and after years of that, I just stopped trying." I watched his face as I spoke, saw him flinch slightly at the truth of it, and I continued because he needed to hear all of it, needed to understand the full scope of what his dismissal had created. "When I got into MIT, you refused to celebrate with me, told me computer science wasn't a real career for women, and when I graduated with honors, you spent the whole dinner talking about Derek's dental practice. And when I got my first real job making $80,000 a year at 26, you asked me when I was going to find something more stable, more respectable." I could see my mother crying quietly now, her hand pressed against her mouth, and several cousins were staring at my father with expressions I couldn't quite read, something between disappointment and recognition. "So I stopped seeking your validation. I stopped trying to prove myself to you because it was clear that nothing I did would ever be enough. And I worked on this patent quietly, in my rental apartment that you're so ashamed of, in the evenings after my regular job that you dismiss as computer stuff, and I did it for myself, not for you." My father's hands were trembling slightly on the armrests of his chair, and he looked older suddenly, diminished by the weight of what I was telling him. "The fact that I became a millionaire the same week you publicly declared me worthless is cosmically ironic, Dad, because it proves that you never knew me at all, that you judged me and found me worthless without ever asking who I actually was or what I was actually capable of achieving." My mother spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper, and she said, "Maya, what can we do? How can we fix this?" And I looked at her, this woman who had sat silently next to my father on that Zoom call and let him humiliate me in front of 47 people without saying a word in my defense, and I felt the same weary sadness I felt looking at my father. "I don't want your money, Mom," I said, and I meant it, every word of it, because I'd realized something fundamental in the past 4 weeks since that Zoom call. I don't need Dad's estate or his inheritance or any financial compensation for the years of being overlooked, because I've built my own success without any of you, and I don't need an apology that's motivated by guilt or embarrassment, now that you know I'm worth something, in the only terms you understand." I paused, gathering my thoughts, trying to articulate what I actually needed from them, what I'd needed my entire life and never received. "What I want is for you to see me, really see me. Not my bank account or my patent or my credentials, but me, the person I've always been, the daughter who was here all along but invisible to you, because I didn't fit your narrow definition of success." The room was absolutely silent now, everyone watching this moment unfold, and I looked directly at my father and said, "That's all I ever wanted, Dad, just to be seen." My father sat there in his armchair for what felt like a full minute without speaking, and I watched his face work through emotions I'd never seen him display before, confusion and shame and something that looked almost like grief, And finally he cleared his throat and said in a voice much quieter than his usual commanding tone, "Maya, can we talk privately, please?" I looked at him, this man who had spent my entire life dismissing me, and I felt the exhaustion of this confrontation settling into my bones, but I nodded because I owed it to myself to see this through to whatever end it might have. We walked through the living room where everyone sat in uncomfortable silence, past Derek, who wouldn't meet my eyes, and Vanessa, who looked like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words, past my mother, who was still crying quietly into her hands, and down the hallway to my father's study, the room where he'd conducted his business for 30 years, and where I'd rarely been invited. He closed the door behind us and stood there for a moment, with his hands still on the doorknob, his back to me, and I could see his shoulders shaking slightly, and when he finally turned around, his eyes were wet, and his face had crumpled into an expression of such raw pain that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I don't know how to fix this," he said, and his voice broke on the last word, and he sat down heavily in his desk chair like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. "I've been thinking since you showed me that bank account, since Marcus recognized your name, since I realized that everything I thought I knew about you was wrong, and I don't know how to make this right." I stood near the door, keeping some distance between us because I wasn't ready to offer comfort, even if he seemed to be breaking down, and I waited for him to continue because this was his moment to confront what he'd done, not mine to make it easier for him. "I never understood your work," he said, and he was looking down at his hands now, not at me. "When you talked about algorithms and data compression and systems architecture, it all sounded like gibberish to me, like something abstract and not quite real, and I felt intimidated by it, by you, by the fact that you were smarter than me in ways I couldn't comprehend or measure." He looked up then, his face raw with an honesty I'd never seen from him before. Derek's success I could understand. I could see his practice and count his patients and hear about his revenue, and Vanessa's marriage to Brad gave me something concrete to point to and be proud of, but you were working on things I couldn't see or touch or explain to other people, and instead of asking you to help me understand, instead of being proud that I'd raised someone brilliant enough to create something that tech companies would pay millions for, I dismissed you because your success made me feel small. It wasn't a complete apology, but it was more honesty than I'd ever gotten from him, and I felt something shift slightly in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that he was finally seeing his own failure. "What can I do, Maya?" he asked, and he looked diminished sitting there in his leather chair, this man who had always seemed so certain of his judgments and so confident in his authority. "I can't take back what I said on that Zoom call. I can't undo the years of making you feel invisible, but tell me what I can do now to start making this right." I thought about what I needed, what would actually matter to me beyond the satisfaction of having proved him wrong, and I realized that the only thing that had ever truly hurt was the public nature of his dismissal. The fact that he'd announced my worthlessness to 47 people without giving me a chance to defend myself. "Reinstate me in your will or don't. I genuinely don't care about the money, Dad," I said. And I meant it because I had my own money now, and I didn't need his estate to validate my worth. "But I need you to acknowledge what you did was wrong, and I need you to do it publicly, the same way you humiliated me publicly on that Zoom call." He nodded slowly, understanding the justice in what I was asking. "I'll do it, whatever you want. I'll send an email to everyone who was on that call. I'll explain what you've achieved and apologize for my judgment." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand in a gesture that made him look suddenly old and vulnerable. "I failed you as a father, Maya. I see that now, and I don't know if you can ever forgive me, but I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to see you, really see you, the way I should have been doing your entire life." 3 months passed, and in that time the world looked different to me, felt different, as if the confrontation with my father had somehow shifted the axis on which everything turned. On July 12th, 2023, exactly 4 months after that Zoom call that had shattered me in front of 47 people, My father sent an email to that same distribution list, and he'd asked my permission before sending it, which was itself remarkable. I'd read the draft he showed me, sitting in a coffee shop in Portland on a Wednesday afternoon, and I'd felt something complicated and tender move through my chest as I read his words explaining my patent, describing the licensing deal with TechCore Industries, acknowledging that he had judged me without ever knowing me, apologizing for the public humiliation he'd inflicted on March 14th. I was wrong about my daughter. Maya, he'd written. I dismissed her achievements because I didn't understand them, and I let my own limitations blind me to her extraordinary capabilities. I have reinstated her fully in my will, though she has made it clear she doesn't need or want my money. Having built her own considerable success through brilliance and hard work, I was too ignorant to recognize. The email was forwarded to me by at least 6 different relatives, some with brief notes of support, and Aunt Linda sent a separate message that said simply, "I'm sorry, Maya. I was wrong too." By that point, I was living in a house I owned, a beautiful 1920s Craftsman in the Laurelhurst neighborhood of Portland that I'd bought in May for $875,000. Paying cash, no mortgage, no debt, just clean, simple ownership of a space that was entirely mine. I'd spent June furnishing it carefully, choosing each piece with intention, and I'd hung my MIT diploma in my home office, along with the framed patent certificate that had arrived in early June, formal and official with my name prominently displayed as the inventor. My relationship with my parents was rebuilding in slow, careful increments, phone calls every Sunday where my father asked genuine questions about my work and listened to the answers, visits every 6 weeks where my mother made an effort to see me as I actually was, rather than as she'd assumed I must be. Derek and Vanessa were awkward around me now, their old, comfortable superiority replaced with something uncertain and almost deferential. And I felt sad about that, because I'd never wanted them to feel diminished, had only wanted to stop being invisible myself. But I'd found something more valuable than their changed perception or my father's belated recognition, something that had been growing quietly inside me since the moment I'd shown my bank account on that Easter Sunday and spoken my truth in front of all those witnesses. I'd found peace with myself, a deep settled knowledge that my worth had never been determined by my family's ability to see it, that I'd been valuable all along whether or not anyone acknowledged it, and that the only person whose recognition truly mattered was my own. On this particular evening in mid-July, I sat in my home office with the window open to let in the cool Portland summer air, my laptop open in front of me, working on the preliminary research for a new patent application involving machine learning optimization for data routing. I was visible to myself now, finally, completely, and that visibility was worth more than any inheritance or apology could ever be.